My guest today is David Carvalho, the founder, CEO, and chief scientist of Naoris Protocol, a decentralized cybersecurity mesh. David is an accomplished leader and innovator who advises nation states and highly regulated sectors on critical issues such as cyber espionage, cyber warfare, and cyber terrorism. He's deeply involved in blockchain-based projects, digital currencies, and cybersecurity innovations. With over 20 years of experience in the field, David has worked as a chief information security officer in multi-billion-dollar companies and brings a forward-thinking approach to risk mitigation, automation, AI, and next-gen cybersecurity. He continues to advise a wide range of organizations from startups to nation-level projects on transformative strategies for the future. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, David. It's a real honor to have you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So in preparation for this interview, I was digging around your LinkedIn, and you have a very extensive background in technology. How did you first get interested in technology, and how did that turn into a career in cybersecurity?
It's kind of funny. I was never interested in technology. I was just interested in innovation. And technology was just the idea that innovation was the easiest. When I was a kid, I was mainly interested in nature. I think I'm somewhere in the spectrum of something.
Yeah.
I would look at ants for like 12 hours. And eventually, for some reason, my dad, which teaches philosophy, decided to buy a computer when I was little, and he didn't ever use it. And it was really, really expensive. And I didn't have anything that I could do in the computer except like format it and reinstall stuff and learn how to program because it was too slow. And I couldn't play any games.
Yeah.
So eventually I got into what you would call these days cyber forensics. At the time, it was just called undeleting stuff. And eventually I found a neighbor that was older than me that actually really helped me get into stuff, and we started coding our own things, and we started exploring malware and a bunch of stuff, and working as a freelancer in the area when I was like 13, 14 years old. Did a lot of things that now would be illegal. At the time, they were probably gray area.
Yeah.
And eventually just became, part of my life. And suddenly I was already working in the area, even with law enforcement, etc., in different verticals of cyber, even before I joined uni. My background these days is mainly as a cybersecurity researcher, so 24 years now of that, and also ethical hacker for the same amount of time. And from an academic perspective, it's cryptography and computing and telematics.
Oh, very interesting. And your current focus is a company called the Naoris Protocol, and I might even guess it's your life's work. Can you maybe explain the problem and how this technology you're developing attempts to solve it?
Sure. So Naoris Protocol is actually a creation that comes from a context of semi-desperation from myself and my peers as chief security officers or chiefs of risk of multi-billion-dollar companies. We have a budget, and it's a limited budget, and we can only buy so many things and hire so many people. And the hackers don't have that problem. They share everything. It's kind of like a meritocracy, really. Mm-hmm. And they don't have a budget. They don't, we need to win every time. They just need to win once.
Yeah.
So, obviously cybersecurity in general, there's no 100% in anything in this area. You can literally spend infinite money and still be hacked anyway. Mm-hmm. So the objective was to find kind of like the sweet spot through innovation, through technology. And at the time, I was advising a number of nation states, as you mentioned, on critical areas like cyber war, cyber espionage, so on and so forth. And a number of former NATO leaders became friends and even mentors, like the former chief of intelligence of NATO, Mr. Schelgenhagen, which he was very involved in the company from the beginning. And he had, a similar vision than me. He thought that bringing different technologies, like for example, blockchain, AI, cybersecurity, or the most mature areas in cybersecurity, and in recently post-quantum capabilities, would really allow for a different approach or angle to tackle the problem. And that's really kind of like the objective that we had. So every device in the world, it doesn't matter if it's one of these or if it's a server or an IoT device or an application or a process, it's really a single point of failure to every other digital device it's connected to from a perspective of cyber. And so the bigger the networks get, the bigger the company gets, actually the bigger the risks become, the bigger the risk surface, as we call it. There's more points of entry. And it's a lot harder to manage and maintain everything just perfect. So really, that's nobody's fault. That's just kind of like how the internet is made and how systems are made.
Yeah.
But our objective was to create, let's call it a primitive, let's say a baseline, a paradigm that would change that would operate at a low layer, and that would actually transform these devices into points of failure, from points of failure into points of resiliency, let's say. So we used, the most cryptographic, resilient environment in the world, which is DLT, a blockchain-based system. We built our own consensus mechanism under a number of mandates of former NATO leaders for critical things. That's called distributed proof of security. That basically allows devices to be nodes on a chain that end up validating each other. So from a perspective of security, trust, best practice, integrity, so on and so forth, right? So the more devices you have under such a structure, the more resilient the whole thing becomes. And then you have the capability to, for example, validate, mathematically, if a system or an API or a server somewhere in another system that you don't control, maybe an API that's exposed to you, that you have access but you don't control, if that system is indeed in a trusted state and the API is maintaining integrity or not. Because if it isn't, probably you don't want to access that data. So if you think about it, having devices have the capability to trust each other and kind of like a decentralized hive mind, let's say, of cryptographic trust is a pretty powerful thing. And this was kind of like what was brought up by my colleagues in my previous roles as something very strategic. And we decided to take that on. And we went to about 15 incubators, global incubators, top incubators in the world. We competed against tens, if not hundreds of thousands of companies. And we won out of 15, we won 12.
Wow.
So that was pretty good.
Yeah.
We're happy with that. We brought really interesting people into the project. I've actually just done a podcast with one of them recently, Mr. David Holtzman, for example, which is one of the grandfathers of the internet, let's call it that. Is our chief of strategy.
He had something to do with DNS,
system.
right? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That little thing, all the DNS.
that little thing that none of us need every day, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And the number of other people, mainly from the defense area, so generals from a number of European countries and so on, that we get advice and access to intelligence resources that align us pretty much on a weekly basis. And yeah, that's kind of like the context in the high level.
Very, very cool. And if I may, I just trying to understand the technology a little bit. Like I get the high level as you put it forward. So you're using the blockchain to create these networks of trust by doing self-validation amongst the different nodes. Would that be like within my organization? Would I have my own blockchain, or are you talking about like a global level trust system?
Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned that. So we built this, and that was one of the mandates that we had, was it had to be private, hybrid, or public.
Okay.
So you can choose what you want, right? So there are some kinds of organizations, like for example, some clients of ours that are related to governments or defense or, critical infrastructure, just think, for example, of a nuclear power plant or whatever. They have completely isolated their systems. So they don't want to touch the internet. However, they can still leverage their whole infrastructure to defend themselves as validators in this case, right? So you would have to tamper with, for it to win, you wouldn't just have to tamper with one system and win. That would be your point of entry or point of failure.
Yeah.
You would have to tamper with all of them at the same time and break the consensus mechanism, which is at post-quantum level, which is really hard, academically speaking, in order to attack a single one. So this is exponentially more resilient. The kinds of environments that end up caring, more about this kind of thing are environments that are indeed highly regulated. So in the financial area, healthcare, government, agencies, defense, anything critical for society, really, ports and rail and things like this, right? So yeah.
And so
now, just answering your question directly, sorry. An environment that air-gapped can completely have a private chain. We call it in our network. We call it, and it's in our white paper, the explanation of it. We call it a Verge cluster. A Verge cluster, it's almost like a sidechain, except it has its own consensus. So you can actually have validations in parallel, which makes it scale very well compared to global change. However, that intelligence, if the client wants or the owner of that network wants, can be shared globally. So other systems somewhere that are similar to that can actually benefit from the risks that are observed there under our distributed artificial intelligence that we probably will talk about. That's called Swarm AI.
Very cool. The other thing I was curious about, you talk about like a trusted state or it's a validated node. Are you tapping into like EDRs or something on the endpoint to get detections to determine if some kind of compromise has happened, or do you have your own presence or way of detecting?
That's a really good question. I'll try not to be too technical, but basically, it doesn't really matter what's the source of the data that gets consumed. It could be an EDR, it could be a SIEM, it could be a collection of tools. But we also have our own capabilities. However, that data gets transmitted to a decentralized agent. So it's a DApp, it's a decentralized application that validates that system is in a trusted state to start with. Therefore, if it is, you want to consume that data. And if it is, it's validated by all to be. And if it isn't, you don't want to consume that data. It's probably manipulated in some way, right? And then it connects directly to the consensus mechanism that's called DPoSec, or Distributed Proof of Security, which we created with a number of academic partners in both sides of the Atlantic. And then it concludes things. So, but the conclusions are based on a provable truth. So, and if you think about it, this is quite powerful. You can actually prove, and it's not just one system saying it, that can be, manipulated somehow. It's actually the whole, group of collection of potential networks that are agreeing that mathematically that's the case of something. But the source of the quote detections or rules are custom. So this can be, from a compliance perspective, so a regulator could have actually visibility over a third-party company, even though they don't have access to their network, but through our chain, they can see just that little bit that they need without sending an auditor there, which is quite interesting. And of course, it's very resilient to, any sort of like tampering, because there's a consensus again. All the way to, pure integrity of things, or any mix of those, or many other things. There's many use cases. We ourselves have built some, but what we want is for people to build on our ecosystem, our chain, which we have a number of clients doing, mainly in critical areas, and also other companies doing. We actually just launched an accelerator, or part of an accelerator, let's say a really big one, that's called the next blockchains, the world's next blockchain startup, I think that's the name, competition. And that's a hackathon, basically, or accelerator, if you want to call it that, for Web3. But most of the applications that we got, and we got dozens, from companies that were in Web2 and wanted to, integrate in some way our technology, either for quantum reasons or quantum resistant reasons, or for decentralization reasons.
Okay, interesting. So it's like a meta layer over top of existing networks that helps coordinate the provable security of the different nodes within each.
I like that you called it a meta layer. I never heard that before. I like that.
Okay.
And we call it a sub-zero layer.
Sub-zero,
so you have
okay.
various layers.
Yeah.
You know, if you remember Mortal Kombat, I actually like that guy.
Yeah.
So we called it Sub-Zero. So there's layer 2s, there's layer 1s in blockchains, there's layer 0, and we are a Sub-Zero layer in essence. So we validate everything that supports the chains, but we also do that for the whole Web2 world. So in other words, we basically come into centralized spaces, be they what they may, and we decentralize them from a fundamental root principle, which is cybersecurity or risk mitigation or assurance by design and default. That's part of it.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like you might have some technical stuff to work out, but it's fascinating. So given your expertise, I would love to dive into quantum a little, if that works for you. It seems like something I think.
For sure.
Yeah. So I guess for our listeners, what exactly is quantum computing and how does it differ from classical computing?
All right. So I think first it's important to define it. Yeah, I agree. So, I'm actually going to talk specifically about cryptography because that's the part that I find the most interesting, not necessarily the physics.
Yeah. Yeah.
Having said that, the physics are also very interesting. So in the quantum realm or non-Newtonian physics, like there are things that we don't understand, but we definitely know are happening.
Yeah.
So if you, for example, have information and you look at that information changes its state, for example, which is something that's at the root of
Schrodinger's
quantum
cat,
computing.
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Schrodinger's cat is the example that is the go-to example. So I'll compare, for example, a qubit, which is basically, for example, in transistors, you have it's like having a light that turns on and off, for example. If it's on, it's 1. If it's off, it's a 0. And then if you have 2, you have 4 states. If you have 3, you have 8 states, so on and so forth, right? So it increases complexity, allows it to do more things. So right now, computers have billions of transistors. And we're reaching the kind of like atomic limits of reduction of things. Yeah. And once we get to that point, we cannot reduce more. So in the quantum computing area, it's kind of the opposite. We are on the subatomic scale, and we're looking at electrons in different layers rotating, and they can assume many states at the same time, which is really interesting, potentially an infinity of them. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you compare, a 1 or a 0 of the traditional computer with a qubit, you only have a 1 or a 0, so you have 2 states. In the other side, you can have infinite states. You can have potentially an infinity between a 0 and a 1, which allows you to basically try and potentially an infinity amount of tries instantly in parallel, mm-hmm. instead of doing them sequentially. Mm-hmm. So if you think about cryptography right now, which is, the interesting part where we get into things with chains and so on, and security, and computing in general. Let's say, I'm going to give you an example of encryption with the real world, let's say, which is something that I like to give. So imagine you have a palette of 32 million colors, right? They're all different from black to white, and the greens and the yellows. You have like 2 million greens and 3 million yellows and so on, different shades, right? And each one of them is unique. And let's say that you have these 32 million colors are inside eggs. So each egg has a color. So I'm going to make an omelet of 256 eggs, okay? And I choose randomly from this palette eggs with colors, right? So as you know, when you mix colors, it gives another color. So I grab my 256 eggs, I write down which eggs I grabbed, right? And I make my omelet. it's a huge omelet that probably has some kind of shade of,
brown,
ground color.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it's unique shape, and if you change one egg, it won't be the same, right? So it's really, really, really hard for me to sequentially try all the possibilities of these 32 million eggs until I actually find the exact 250 colors that went into it. Right? It's really hard. I would say it's almost impossible, right? And so that's basically how cryptography works right now. There is a difficulty in the direction of brute force, right? Which is what I'm talking about. And there is simplicity in the direction of creation. So you have a formula, aka a key. You know exactly which eggs went into the omelet. So you can also you can always reproduce that color easily, right? And you can go back again, right, back into the eggs because you know which ones they are. And that's why cryptography works. It's really hard to find the omelet and find the color again and do it again, right? But with quantum computers, that's not the case. If you have, for example, 250 qubits, you could potentially figure out the omelet instantaneously.
Sure.
Right? And so that leads us to problems that are fundamental right now, like, any critical infrastructure environment, government, military is investing a lot and is quite aware of they can see the risks coming from far away. In the quantum computing risk or quantum singularity or quantum computer with enough qubits or whatever you want to call it, it's going to happen if it didn't happen already to actually break elliptic curve cryptography. And when that date happens, if it didn't happen already, it will allow for the revelation of all secrets everywhere at the same time for everything. And that's I cannot imagine a more imbalancing thing in the world right now, like from a geopolitical perspective, power perspective, so on and so forth, right? So in order to mitigate that, there have been an effort from the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, which is the organization that globally defines the standards for cryptography for everything that matters in the world, from banking to military encryption, like advanced encryption standard and others as standards, to create what's called post-quantum cryptography or quantum resistance cryptography or quantum safe cryptography. And there was a competition for the last years with a number of universities and companies that participated. And just recently, the winner was announced. And funny enough, we have been using them for about 3 years in our chain. And in about October last year, we went and presented our paper, actually, that talked about the use of moving towards post-quantum capabilities on blockchains because there's a massive risk for them.
Yeah. Because right now that's basically all that like a cryptocurrency wallet holds is like a hard math problem, essentially, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So if you can solve those
the
problems
between you having your coins and you not having your coins.
Yeah. So just a small risk there. Nobody would try and steal billions of dollars, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or like 2.4 trillion, right? So, but that is only like 1% of the global economy.
Yeah.
But the problem is everywhere. The blockchains are actually the most highly resilient cryptographic spaces there are, because of their consensus mechanisms, etc. However, there have been leaks from across the internet, and we also, through the access that we have to intelligence, have access to such information that basically claims that, for example, RSA 2048 has been broken, right? And that's not scary at all. Like 2048 bit is really high. And if you look, for example, at blockchains, that's, for example, 32 bytes. So that's 256 bits, right? For Ethereum, for Bitcoin, for so on and so forth. And most of the world's cryptography is like that, if not all. So, the funny thing is that it almost doesn't matter if that quantum singularity is going to happen now or in a year or 2 years or 5 years. It's going to happen. But the reason why it almost doesn't matter, it's because there is already a big effort from a number of nation state threat actors and players, let's say, and also associated with nation states, that are basically gathering and grabbing keys with the objective of decrypting them later.
In the future, yeah. And I'm sure governments everywhere are also gathering encrypted communications and all that stuff, just waiting for the day that they can go harvest it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that's why, and I talk about that all the time in conferences and so on, organizations that really care about, their IP, their 5-year plans, their secrets, nation states, governments, critical environments, so on and so forth, highly regulated spaces, need to start thinking about that now. Mm-hmm. Even about 2 weeks ago, NIST has come out and said that all federal agencies in the US are mandated to migrate. Mm-hmm. And so that means that in about 1-2 years, it's probably going to be part of some international standard, right? Yep. Which it makes sense. Our effort was more to create a highly resilient cryptographic space that would be kind of like a level up from where chains are right now. Not necessarily just to help the Web3 world, but because we already have a consensus that basically decentralizes centralized spaces, right? But in this case, it would be a very resilient system that supports all computation and data production and digital processes that exist right now. So it's a big project with big ambitions.
So who's leading the space in quantum computing? And I know that like the computational power is measured in qubits. Like, where are we as far as the qubits are in, like, at what level does that actually become something that can do real world problems? Because I know right now they have it working in a lab on sort of a smaller level, but like, what does it look like now, and how far do we have to go before it's a real threat?
I think there's a lot of disinformation out there about this, and also a lot of I don't think the truth is all out there for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. I mean, if there is, if anybody has an edge over anybody else, they want you to think that they don't.
Right.
Right, while they're actually running, because that's the advantage of that threat actor. So, it's known that there are constant advances that basically deal with the problems that exist right now in quantum computers, like the problem that they need, for example, extremely low temperatures and vacuum, and other problems that they react very badly to any noise, and even to the globe magnetosphere, so on. So there have been massive advances in all these fields, and this is no longer kind of like a theoretical problem. Mm-hmm. It is an engineering problem. And you know what that means. Yeah. If it is an engineering problem, it's just like putting the man on the moon. We know we can build a rocket.
Time.
We just don't know. Yeah. It's time. It's a function of time and investment. Yeah. Right. So if you put enough good brains on it, you're going to have, that capability. So if, for example, if you sum all the investment on it, right? So for example, let's say China, right? I am currently in Hong Kong. So China is known to probably be the biggest investor in this area because they see it as a strategic thing, as does the US, as does the EU. But it's a different level of investment. So it's known they put, for example, $15 billion into this problem. That's what's known. In reality, if you sum all the investments between the private sector and military and other potentially, gray or black budgets, you should probably be looking at like 10 to 15x that, right? And that's like 150 to $200 billion. Yes. And if you think about that, that's a massive, massive, massive budget. That's like, for example, the UK, I think, is going to spend in the modernization of their whole nuclear arsenal.
Right.
So the impact of this is really, really, I can't overstate this enough. Like, it's like the year 2000 bug, but for real, for everything. But much worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fundamental problem that needs to be solved from you need to be conscious that there is an attacking possibility, an offensive possibility, and you need to basically have some preparedness. And I think very soon companies will need to start moving, how can I say, doing, plans just like they have, for example, a cloud migration plan or an AI plan. They need to have a post-quantum plan if they want to keep operating, because you just probably can't take the risk that someone is seeing everything you're doing all the time and your encryption matters nothing.
Sure.
Right.
So what about companies that are offering post-quantum cryptography now? Like if they're just using bigger keys, which is sort of how I'm assuming they're doing it, isn't that also just vulnerable to quantum computing as well?
That's interesting you mentioned that. So quantum cryptography is lattice-based. It's not elliptic curve-based. So there are different, not to go into technical things, but there are different primitives mathematical primitives that are part of the problem that we believe, and at least the tests that we have, when I say we, I mean ourselves, NIST, so on and so forth, have done with existing quantum chips and extrapolated those attacks, let's say, at a much higher level, and also other traditional, mathematical vulnerabilities and so on, and they survived those, and so probably this is going to continue to evolve, right? I don't think we have achieved any sort of like static quantum resistance, but it is a way for traditional computers to create cryptography that it doesn't demand the need of a quantum computer to create it. So it can apply to, the world as it is right now. So data at rest, data in transit, legacy things, new things, right? And this is kind of like a function of economics, like how can I say, capitalism, right? I mean, if you do something that's good and that works and it's efficient and it's cheap, then that's probably going to be the standard. So this is currently seen as standard, but it's going to continue to evolve. So will a quantum computer be able to break a post-quantum key? Probably it will take a very, very long time, or it's going to be very, very expensive. Like let's say you are a nation state that doesn't care about privacy, just say that. Or you care, but you care about getting privacy away from your citizens. So let's say with the quantum computer and current cryptography, you would be able to just have very, very, very aggressive attacks against all data, everywhere, for everything. So there would be no more privacy, regardless of whatever you would do, right? And this is not a world that's good, that we would like to live in. So with post-quantum cryptography, those difficulties actually, from a cryptography breaking perspective, go up quite a bit. And if you add that from a decentralized perspective, they go up also exponentially. You probably wouldn't have just to break one system. Maybe the key is derived from, thousands of systems or something like that, right? You can have, distributed key management systems that right now don't exist. And we're very, involved in that. That's something that excites us a lot.
But the strategy still becomes to make it more and more computationally expensive. Like, that's how we keep things safe. That doesn't change. It's just a different way of making it computationally expensive.
It's interesting because you're right. I mean, that doesn't change. Like, let's say you're a guy that wants to rob a house, and you're walking in the street, and all the houses have an open door, and one has one that's closed with locks all over. You're like, nah, I'm going to go into the open door. And nobody got time for that.
Yeah.
So So the way we're dealing with the quantum quote quote problem or opportunity is that's one of the strategies. There's other strategies, but creating resilience that is a resilient based on time or computation difficulty is the right way, because that's probably what we have done historically through cryptography that has worked the best.
Mm-hmm. So it'll continue to be a race.
That's right. That's right.
Are there any key milestones or technological breakthroughs that people are trying to overcome right now that sort of mark the beginning of the next chunk of progress? Are we stuck anywhere right now?
Yeah, I think we're stuck in a number of things. So there are fabrication issues with quantum computers. So right now they're kind of like all made by hand.
Right. Yeah. I've seen some pictures. They do look like almost like a chandelier that I would make with my daughter.
So they require, as you say, exactly like very precise fabrication, but they are still kind of like works of art.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's not unusual to us. I mean, during the time of like transistors that were basically light bulbs, or like cathode lamps, it was basically the same story. But those problems were surpassed. Again, these are all engineering problems. They are not theoretical problems. So with the massive investment that there is in the space, and there's an estimate that by, for example, 2050, which is only 25 years from here, 26, we'll have $500 billion invested just by China in this area. And probably the EU and the US together, it's another 500, right? So this is definitely a big thing. I would say it's much bigger even than AI. AI just now it's a very shiny object, but it's going to dominate its workings as well. And the whole work of everything computationally. So there are a number of challenges right now on the on the quantum side. These challenges are related, and of course there's innovations about these probably every week. Many of them are not broadcasted for strategic reasons, but this would be around problems that I mentioned before, problems with error correction, and because the more it grows, the more interference there is. However, and there is like this idea that you need a lot of qubits to break certain cryptographic principles. Apparently, there have been some innovations recently in the Far East that say that maybe you don't. You just need a different algorithm.
Sure, I was going to say, if you have infinite recursion instantly and you can rewrite the algorithm, I always think of the Towers of Hanoi problem, which if you try and write by hand, it's like, pages and pages of code, but it's 2 lines of recursion. I could see a similar approach being more effective at leveraging those qubits.
Yeah. So there's qubit control and scaling kind of like approaches. The solution is kind of like to try to separate them in a way, or try to isolate them. And there's all sorts of like products that are being created to do that. So it is an arms race from a cryptographics perspective that, obviously these days, and this is an area that we participate quite a bit on, and our advisors too, which is related to, geostrategics and so on. Cyber is now probably the most important domain of cyber warfare, of warfare in general, sorry. So there's, land, sea, and air in cyber. And 15 years ago, cyber didn't exist as a domain. Yeah. And right now it's probably the most important. So you can, potentially, let's say win a conflict or be a victor in other ways in a conflict without even participating in it from a kinetic perspective, like theoretically, right? And I think everybody that is involved in that kind of world understands that. And let's say quantum innovations are potentially a shortcut to that, but at the same time, as we understand, they potentially can be probably the biggest disruptor of world stability at the same time. So plans need to be made.
Yeah. For anybody listening who's interested in sort of pursuing this as a career path, is there any interdisciplinary skills or things you think they should be looking at or thinking about as they plan their education and stuff like that?
That's interesting. My background is not in the quantum computing area. Yes, I have a background in cryptography, but the physics are now landing in the cryptographic area, right? So, and that's very interesting. So I guess it's hard for me to give advice to something that, let's say you're going to go to uni now. There is a high probability that whatever course you're getting into, when you finish
it's done.
like maybe our conversation is being deprecated here.
Yeah.
Having said that, from a best effort perspective, I would probably say either physics, theoretical or applied physics, to actually deal with the things, which, in the end, you're probably going to still have, quite a bit of work around, programming and things like this, because in the end, it is a computer.
Yeah.
But to get deeper into this area, which is in this interview, we're more focused about quantum, I think that would probably be the way. Yeah, I'm not so sure if there are
cryptography, obviously being a big part too, right?
Oh yeah, cryptography being a big part too, because it's about the defense side, right? Generally, off the offense side is more sexy, because there is always an advantage of being on the offensive side and other things, but we rest squarely on the defensive side, and we are always trying to find methods to transparently, and of course we collaborate a lot with universities too in both sides of the Atlantic. We're always looking at ways to transparently use decentralization and post-quantum capabilities to transparently integrate with things that exist already that are not going away.
Yeah.
But they need that resilience, that change into the future, like, for example, fundamental internet protocols, right? In other things like that.
Yeah. Okay. This is the last one I have for you. It's the one I ask of everybody that comes on the show. It can be as wide or as narrow as you want. Do you have any predictions for the future of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I have. It's a very broad question. I'll do my best at answering it. I am, you can pin me against the wall for this, but I am quite pessimistic about it. It's only going to get worse and worse, I believe. Especially as, tens of billions of IoT devices that have internet connectivity and connect to networks. Like IoT, I call it Internet of Trouble. I don't know if you know that. And there is no way to manage many of them they don't receive updates. There's no such thing. Yeah. There's no mechanism. They don't follow any standard. There's no compliance. If you look today, so I'll tell you a story about, and that's to finalize kind of like my answer. About 10 years ago, right? If you went to the dark web and you were looking, for example, to connect to a system to do some fraud or something like that, or credit card fraud or whatever, there would be environments that would sell this to you, and they would be computers. They would be actually connected to a server somewhere or to a computer somewhere. Always, right? And generally Windows systems. Not always, but mainly. These days, I don't think you'll almost find any computer. You'll find smart TVs. You'll find smart coffee machines. You'll find routers,
toothbrushes.
You're going to find, whatever,
Yeah.
exactly, like sex toys, whatever you can imagine, like heart battery machines, whatever it's called,
Pacemakers,
pacemakers. That's right. And so on and so forth, right? Oh, I hacked your network through, I don't know, your fridge or your printer. Like, so this is extremely problematic. And the other problem is that everything is a point of failure for everything, which is what we're talking about. And this only increases this only increases the risk of everything else. So the more things you add, the more risk you add, it just exponentially makes everything worse, especially if there's things that you can't control. So our effort is really to change that. But why am I pessimistic besides that? I am pessimistic because I think that not enough work is being done to actually deal with AI-related issues as well. There is a huge problem in trust in AI. So you can actually use AI right now to do anything, including hacking systems. I think the defense side is moving really, really slowly. Normally, the offensive side has the advantage, but in here, I think the advantage is stratospheric. And I think it's going to be more and more used. The same with decentralized, systems. So normally, say if you have a botnet that attacks, collects, millions of zombies and brings down, say, AWS or whatever, or Facebook or something like this, you can actually kill it right now by attacking the command and control server, which is a centralized system.
Yeah.
But they are now using, there have been botnets that use smart contracts in the blockchain, for example. They don't have a point of failure. Like, you need to kill all the validators in a chain, and you kill the chain that's making money for a lot of people to do that potentially, right? So there's a lot to be said there. There's a lot of new threats that the infrastructure that was created right now is not ready for it, and it's across the board. And now you can add cryptography to the list, something that we thought was pretty stable. It's not at all. It's in flux, like it hasn't been since its creation in a computation context.
Well, that's something to think about. Sometimes we get rosy predictions, and other times we get ones like yours.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm a glass half full guy myself, so I appreciate it for sure. David, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us today. It's a fascinating subject. I think I might have to call you up again in the future to deep dive different aspects of it, but really appreciate the overview today.
It will be my pleasure. Okay. Thank you so much for your questions and your time, and looking forward to talking to you again.
Okay, take care, sir. Bye.